The void between stars had a sound, and it wasn't silence. It was the low, weary hum of the Valiance's life support, a mechanical ghost that had haunted Elias Thorne for 20 years. He stood on the observation deck, a ghost himself, reflected in the reinforced plasteel that separated him from the cold, uncaring dark. Humanity had clawed its way to the stars only to find them empty, or worse, occupied by things that wished they had stayed on their little blue marble. The Outer Rim was a graveyard of those ambitions, a place where empires came to die, and humanity's contribution to the galactic morgue was the last chance Armada. They weren't heroes or explorers. They were the janitors, the executioners, the ones you called when diplomacy failed and genocide was the only language left. Elias ran a hand over the scuffed insignia on his shoulder, the stylized skull and cross-wrenched bones of the 7th Marine Expeditionary Unit. They didn't fix things. They dismantled them. He was staring at the Seraphim Nebula, a swirl of cosmic dust that looked like a bloodstain on a black sheet, when the alert chimed. It wasn't the sharp, frantic alarm of an incoming attack, but a softer, more insidious tone reserved for unknowns. Across the deck, Commander Eva Rostova didn't turn from the central holotable, her voice calm and serrated as broken glass, cut through the low hum. "Report," the comms officer, a young ensign with perpetually wide eyes, swallowed hard. "Ma'am, we're receiving a distress call. Subspace, Diet beam, heavily degraded. It's non-human." Rostov finally looked up, her cybernetic right eye glowing a faint, analytical blue. She was a relic of the synth wars, a woman more machine than flesh, and her patience was measured in nanoseconds. "Specify." The ensign hesitated. "It's Kurun, Admiral. Standard Royal Fleet encryption, but the signal is screaming." A chill traced its way down Elias's spine, a feeling he hadn't felt since the siege of Orion Vive. The Kurun didn't scream. The insectoid species, with their rigid honor codes and telepathic hive minds, were the Stoics of the galaxy. They had once glassed 3 human colonies in a territorial dispute, their ships moving with the silent, synchronized grace of a scalpel. They didn't plead. They conquered. "On screen," Rostova commanded. The nebula vanished, replaced by a flickering image of a Kirin command bridge. It was chaos. Crystalline control panels were shattered, and the air was thick with a green, acrid smoke. But it was the Kurun themselves that held the attention, their multifaceted eyes, usually gleaming with cold intelligence, were dull and wide with terror. One was on its knees, carapace trembling, rhythmically knocking its head against the deck. Another was clawing at its own face, thin, chitinous fingers leaving deep gouges. In the center of the frame stood a matriarch, her royal crest cracked, one of her 4 arms limp at her side, her psychic voice, filtered and mangled by the failing transmitter, filled the bridge of the Valiance. It wasn't a request for aid. It was a shriek of pure, undiluted horror. It hears the hush. It empties the mind. Silence. The great silence is coming. Then the feed cut out, leaving only a hiss of static that felt colder than the vacuum outside. For a long moment, the only sound was the ship's life support. Elias met Rostova's gaze across the deck. Her human eye was narrowed, but the cybernetic one was already processing, cross-referencing, calculating odds. "Elias," she said, her voice betraying no emotion. Suit up your team. I want to know what makes a K'ruun scream." The boarding shuttle cut through the debris field surrounding the K'ruun fleet. What was once a perfectly symmetrical formation of crystalline warships now looked like a shattered chandelier. Hulls were intact. No scorch marks from plasma, no breaches from kinetic strikes. They just looked dead. No weapon signatures, no energy readings, nothing. His second-in-command, Kalen, reported from the co-pilot seat. "It's like they just turned everything off and died." Elias tightened his grip on the pulse rifle resting across his knees. Or something turned them off. He led his fire team, 4 battle-hardened Marines who had seen the worst the galaxy had to offer, through the airlock of the K'ruun flagship. The inner door hissed open, and the smell hit them first. It wasn't the smell of death, not the coppery tang of blood or the rot of decay. It was the sterile ozone scent of a discharged battery, clean and utterly wrong. The corridor was lit by emergency lighting that cast long, dancing shadows. There were bodies, dozens of them, slumped in corridors and against bulkheads. Not a single wound on any of them. Their eyes were open, staring at nothing, their faces frozen in expressions of primal terror. They looked like statues sculpted from fear. "Check vitals," Elias ordered, his voice tight. Jorik, the team's medic, knelt beside a K'ruun warrior, his scanner emitting a low hum. "He's dead, Commander, but I don't know how. Neural activity is 0, flatlined. But there's no sign of trauma, no pathogen, no radiation. His brain just stopped." As they moved deeper into the ship, the silence became a physical presence. It pressed in on them, muffling the sound of their own breathing. They found the command bridge, the source of the distress call. The matriarch was there, slumped in her command throne. She was still alive. Her multifaceted eyes tracked their approach, but there was no recognition, no thought behind them. She was a hollowed-out shell. She began to whisper, a dry, rasping sound from her mandibles. The word was alien, but the ship's onboard translator projected the meaning into their helmets in a flat, monotone voice. "Empty, empty, empty." Elias knelt before her, keeping his weapon lowered. "Matriarch, what happened here? What is the hush?" Her eyes focused on him for a fleeting second, and in that moment, he felt a psychic touch, a sliver of ice sliding into his mind. It wasn't a message, it was a memory, a feeling. He saw a vast, silent ocean of black, a conscious nothingness that didn't consume, but simply erased. It was the feeling of forgetting your own name, the face of your mother, the warmth of the sun. It was the absolute certainty that you had never existed at all. The contact lasted less than a second before she convulsed, her body arching in a silent scream. Yorick rushed forward, but it was too late. The light in her eyes faded, and the last living K'ruun on the bridge was gone. "Commander?" Kalen's voice crackled over the comm. "We found something in the ship's memory core. It's not a log. It looks like a warning." Back on the Valiance, Admiral Rostova watched the data stream across the main holotable. It wasn't a coherent message. It was a chaotic collage of sensor readings, panicked psychic imprints, and frantic stellar cartography. The K'ruun fleet had been charting a region of unknown space they called the Veil of Whispers. Their probes began to go silent, not destroyed, but simply ceasing to exist on any sensor spectrum. Then the outer patrol ships went dark. The crews didn't report an attack. They just stopped communicating. The final entries were from the flagship itself. Life signs dropping off deck by deck. Crew members suffering from what their medics called total neural cascade, sudden, irreversible brain death. The last coherent thought recorded from the matriarch was not for her people, but for her enemies. Their chaos, their dissonance, the static of their minds. It is the only sound that defies the hush. Find the humans. They are the only ones loud enough to be heard in the great silence. Rostova looked up from the table, her gaze sweeping over her command crew. They weren't running to us for help, she said, her voice resonating with a grim understanding. They were bringing us a weapon. Elias stood with her, watching the data swirl. The memory of the matriarch's touch still lingered at the edge of his consciousness, a cold spot in his soul. "The weapon is us," he said quietly. "Our minds, our rage, our fear, our insanity. It's like we're noise. And this hush is a perfect silence that can't tolerate it." A debate erupted on the bridge. The fleet's political officer argued for quarantine, for leaving the Kirin ships and this sector immediately. He called it a psychic plague, a mimetic hazard they had no defense against. Others saw it as an opportunity, a new form of warfare. But Rostova was silent, her cybernetic eye glowing as it processed the horrifying implications. She turned to Elias. The Kir'un were a psychic monoculture, a single, harmonious mind, easy to erase. But humanity, we're a riot, a billion screaming, contradictory voices in one skull. We might just be the only thing in the galaxy that can fight a war against nothing. Her decision was made. The last chance Armada would not run. It would hold the line. They would study the dead ships, analyze the psychic residue, and prepare for a war against an enemy that had no form, no army, and no motive other than the expansion of its own perfect, empty silence. The first sign that the enemy was already among them came 3 hours later. Elias was in the mess hall, trying to choke down a nutrient paste that tasted like despair. When the ship-wide comms crackled, it was just static at first, a low hiss. But then, for a fraction of a second, the static formed a word. Elias's blood ran cold. It was the same word the matriarch had whispered. Empty. He looked up and saw that everyone else had heard it too. Fear, raw and palpable, spread through the room. That night, the nightmares began. Elias dreamt he was floating in an endless, starless void. There was no sound, no light, no sensation. He tried to scream, but he had no mouth. He tried to remember his name, but his mind was a smooth, blank slate. He was nothing, and he had always been nothing. He awoke with a gasp, his heart hammering against his ribs, the single word echoing in the sudden quiet of his quarters. Empty. It wasn't just a bad dream. It was an intrusion. Something was reaching out, testing the walls of his mind. He got up and walked to the small viewport in his room. He looked out at the silent, derelict Kirin ships, hanging in the void like forgotten bones. But beyond them, in the deep black, he felt it, a presence, an awareness defined by its own lack of being. It wasn't watching him, it was listening, waiting for him to fall silent. It was waiting for the chaos in his human soul to finally quiet down, so it could erase the noise. And in that moment, Elias Thorne understood the Kirun's terror. This wasn't a war you could win with guns and ships. This was a war for your own existence, fought in the silent, screaming battlefield of your own mind against an enemy that was already inside you, patiently waiting for you to forget you were ever there at all. The Great Silence was coming, and the Last Chance Armada, humanity's loudest, most violent, and most broken creation, was standing right in its path. The Valiance was no longer a warship. It was a cage rattling with ghosts. The initial shock had curdled into a thick, corrosive paranoia that seeped through the recycled air. Crew members eyed each other in the corridors, their conversations clipped and low, as if speaking too loudly might attract the attention of the silence. Sleep became a currency more valuable than rations, and men woke up not with a scream, but with a horrifying, breathless quiet, their eyes wide with the memory of being unmade. The first casualty was not from an attack, but from a choice. A young engineer named Corporal Finn, a man known for his booming laugh and terrible jokes, was found in a maintenance crawl space. He hadn't used a weapon. He had methodically and silently disconnected his own life support, his face a mask of serene emptiness. He left no note, no final message. There was just a single word scrawled on the bulkhead next to his body in his own blood quiet. The word was a verdict, and it sent a ripple of absolute terror through the fleet. This wasn't a plague. It was a conversion. Admiral Rostova responded with the cold fury of a machine calculating an unacceptable variable. She locked down the fleet, severing all but the most essential comms channels and imposing a strict psychological monitoring protocol on every soul under her command. She then summoned Elias to her ready room, a Spartan chamber dominated by a single, massive viewport staring into the void. The enemy is not outside the ship. Elias, she began, her voice a low monotone that did nothing to hide the urgency. It's a mimetic virus, a cognitive predator. It hunts thought. We cannot fight it with plasma. We must fight it with understanding. She gestured to a secondary screen, where the face of a man Elias hadn't seen in 10 years stared back at him. He was older, thinner, with the same sharp features as Elias, but without the scars and the weariness. His eyes held an academic's detached curiosity. This is Dr. Eris Thorne, my new head of cognitive defense. Elias felt a muscle in his jaw twitch. My brother, you, brought him here. Eris was the family's genius, the one who had traded a rifle for a stack of data slates, delving into the esoteric field of xenopsychology while Elias was fighting in the mud of a dozen forgotten worlds. They hadn't spoken since their father's funeral, a stilted, awkward affair where Aris had tried to analyze Elias's grief as a standard trauma response. He is the foremost expert on non-standard consciousness in the sector, Rostova stated, ignoring the personal history. He and his team are being transferred from the research vessel Sagan. They will form the core of a new unit. You and your Marines will be their security and their primary test subjects. Your team has proven resilient. Resilient was one word for it. Elias's squad was a collection of fractured souls, men held together by scar tissue and shared trauma. Their minds weren't quiet places. They were a constant storm of rage, regret, and black humor. Perhaps that was their armor. Iris arrived with a small team of academics and a mountain of esoteric equipment. The reunion was as cold as Elias had expected. Elias. Aris greeted him with a clinical nod. Your biometric readings indicate elevated stress levels. Expected under the circumstances. Iris. Elias replied, his voice flat. Try not to get us all killed with a textbook. The newly formed Cognitive Defense Unit, or CDU, transformed a section of the medbay into a laboratory of the mind. Crew members who reported nightmares were brought in, hooked up to neural scanners that translated their brain activity into swirling, chaotic patterns on a holoscreen. Aris and his team moved among the consoles, whispering in a language of synaptic feedback and mimetic decay. They found a pattern. The nightmares were not random. Every subject reported the same core experience, the sensation of being in a vast, black ocean, a place without sensation or identity. They called it the static sea. The hush, Aris theorized, wasn't just erasing minds. It was pulling them into its own state of being, an endless, featureless void. It's not killing, Aris explained during a briefing, his eyes alight with a terrifying intellectual fervor. It's assimilating. It finds an ordered consciousness, a coherent mind like a Karun's, and it flattens it, smooths out the noise of identity until it matches its own perfect null state. It's the cognitive equivalent of entropy. So how do we fight it? Elias asked, cutting through the jargon. Aris turned to him, a faint, condescending smile on his lips. That is the question. The Kirin mind was like a perfect crystal struck with the right frequency. It shattered. A human mind, especially a mind like yours, is more akin to a chaotic gas. There's no single frequency to target. It's just noise. The condescension was infuriating, but the logic was sound. Their insanity was their shield. But a shield wasn't a weapon. To forge one, they needed more data. They needed to go back to the source. Elias found himself once again leading a team onto the dead Kir'un flagship. This time, he was escorting his brother. The ship was colder now, the silence deeper, more absolute. Aris and his team set up their scanners on the bridge. The hum of their equipment, an obscene intrusion into the vessel's tomb-like stillness. Elias and his marines stood guard, weapons raised, scanning the shadows that seemed to writhe at the edge of their vision. They weren't just shadows. They were gaps, places where the light seemed to bend away, where reality felt thin. The psychic residue is immense, Aris muttered, staring at a complex waveform. The final moments of the hive mind, it's like a psychic scar burned into the fabric of the ship. He pointed to a small, unassuming chamber off the main bridge. It had been overlooked in the first sweep. The Kir'un called it a resonance chamber, a place for the matriarchs to commune with the collective consciousness of their species. The epicenter is in there, Aris said, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and excitement. The last thought of an entire species is echoing in that room. Elias gripped his rifle. And you want to go in there? We have to, Aris insisted. This is our only chance to observe the predator's feeding method directly. Elias posted his team at the door and followed his brother inside. The room was a perfect sphere, its crystalline walls glowing with a faint, internal light. There was nothing inside but the two of them and a low, subsonic hum that vibrated in their bones. Aris activated a handheld device, and the hum intensified. The light in the walls began to pulse. Then, Elias felt it. The same cold touch he'd felt from the dying matriarch, but 1,000 times stronger. The room seemed to dissolve around him, replaced by the black, silent ocean of his nightmares. But this time, he wasn't alone. He felt a vast, ancient, and utterly empty consciousness press in on him. It wasn't hostile. It was like water seeping into cracks, patiently looking for a way in, a way to smooth out the jagged edges of his soul. He felt it brush against his memories, the screams of the dying on Orion V, the face of his mother as she faded in a hospital bed, the bitter taste of whiskey in a lonely starport bar. And he felt the presence recoil. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible shift, but it was undeniable. The noise, the pain, the chaos of his mind was unpalatable to it. It was like trying to drink acid. Eris was on his knees, his face pale, sweat beading on his forehead. "Did you feel that?" He gasped. It doesn't feed on consciousness. It feeds on coherence, on order. When it touched my ordered, analytical thoughts, I felt it pulling. But when it touched you, he looked at Elias with something that wasn't condescension, but a dawning, horrified respect. Your mind, it's like poison to it. All your rage, your trauma, it can't digest it. It's too loud. Elias pulled his brother to his feet, the cold of the static sea slowly receding. He looked around the chamber, at the silent, listening ship. They had a name for their enemy. They had a motive. And now, they had the beginnings of a weapon. Back on the Valiants, they presented their findings to Rostova. Her cybernetic eye whirred as it processed the data, the psychic logs, and their testimony. So, this, a causal cognitive entity, as you call it, is a predator that hunts order, she summarized, her voice flat. And we are, by our very nature, anathema to it. Eris nodded. In essence, yes. Our psychological entropy is our greatest defense. A defense is not enough, Rostova stated, turning her gaze to the star chart, to the vast, unexplored territory of the Veil of Whispers. Doctor, you have given me the enemy's weakness. Elias, she said, her voice dropping, taking on the hard, sharp edge of a commander on the eve of battle. You will help me weaponize it. We are not going to hide from the great silence. We are going to teach it how to scream. The cage was about to be opened, and the ghosts inside were about to be unleashed. Project Dissonance was born in the sterile confines of Medbay 7, a place that quickly became known as the Cognitive Forge. The name was grimly appropriate, here, under his brother's detached supervision. Elias watched his Marines, his family be systematically broken down and mined for the raw materials of war. The process was a violation. Each Marine was placed in a neural interface cradle, a coffin-like pod that isolated them from all external stimuli. They were then guided by Eris and his team into the darkest corners of their own minds, forced to relive the moments that had fractured their souls. Kalen went first. His session focused on the fall of Cygnus X-1, a colony world where he'd been stationed. The CDU didn't just ask him to remember, they amplified the memory, sharpening the edges, turning up the volume on the screams, making the smell of burning plasticrete and cooked flesh as real as the air in the pod. On the holoscreen, Kalen's raw, unfiltered agony was translated into a jagged, shrieking waveform of pure psychic noise. Elias stood with his arms crossed, a statue of impotent fury. As he listened to his friend's muffled sobs through the pod's thick walls, Eris, however, was ecstatic. He moved between consoles, his fingers flying across the keypads. "Look at the amplitude," he exclaimed, his voice buzzing with academic discovery. "The emotional resonance from a single Targeted trauma is 1,000 times more potent than generalized anxiety. It's not just noise. Elias, it's a structured, weaponizable lament. It's beautiful. There's nothing beautiful about it. Aris, Elias growled, his knuckles white. You're harvesting their souls. We're building a lighthouse from their ghosts, Aris retorted without looking up. The alternative is letting the fog consume us all. The lamentations, as Aris called them, were recorded, refined, and stored in crystalline data matrices. They had collected the terror of a child soldier on a forgotten moon, the grief of a man who'd spaced his own infected wife, the pure animal rage of a berserker lost in the bloodlust of a boarding action. The arsenal of Project Dissonance was a library of human suffering. Their first test was a grim success. They loaded a single, potent memory, Jorik's memory of being the sole survivor of a shuttle crash, listening to his comrades suffocate one by one over the comms into a small psychic resonator. A stealth drone delivered the device to the hull of one of the smaller, derelict Kirun cruisers. From the Valiance's observation deck, they watched. The drone attached the resonator, and Aris gave the signal. There was no explosion, no flash of light, but Elias felt it in his teeth, a high-frequency vibration at the edge of hearing. On the screens, the derelict ship convulsed. Its internal lights, long dead, flickered erratically. A low, mournful groan echoed through subspace, a sound that shouldn't have been possible in a vacuum. It was the sound of a dead thing dreaming a stranger's nightmare. Then, it was over. "What happened?" Rostova asked, her voice uncharacteristically tight. Aris pointed to the sensor readings. The psychic residue of the hush, the ambient silence within that ship's hull has been corrupted. It didn't just retreat, it's been shattered. It's been replaced by what I can only describe as psychic shrapnel. That ship is no longer empty. It's haunted. The success, however, came at a cost. The broadcast, as crude and undirected as it was, had acted like a flare in the dark. The hush, which had been a passive, encroaching presence, reacted. It began to adapt. The nightmares aboard the Valiance lessened, but they were replaced by something far worse. Crew members began reporting dead zones in the ship's small, localized pockets of absolute sensory and psychic silence. You'd walk into a corridor, and for a few feet, the hum of the life support would vanish. The air would feel cold and thin. Your own thoughts would become distant, muted, as if they belonged to someone else. It was the static sea, bleeding into reality. The first person to get trapped was a young navigator named Petra. She walked into a supply closet and didn't come out. When her frantic crewmates forced the door, they found her standing perfectly still, her eyes wide and blank, a thin line of drool on her chin. She was physically unharmed, but her mind was gone, adrift in the silent pocket that had formed inside the tiny room. Yorick managed to stabilize her, but the diagnosis was chilling. "It's the same as the Karun," he reported, his voice shaking. "Total neural cascade. The dead zone. It quarantined her mind and then erased it." The hush was no longer just waiting for them to fall quiet. It was actively building walls of silence to contain the noise. It was learning. The incident drove the wedge between Elias and his brother deeper. "This is your fault," Elias roared, slamming Aris against a bulkhead in the cognitive forge. "You poked the damn thing with a stick, and now it's hunting us inside our own ship." "It's a calculated risk," Aris shot back, pushing him away. his face a mixture of anger and scientific indignation. We confirmed the entity is reactive. This is a monumental discovery. We now know we can provoke it, force it to reveal its methods. She's not a discovery, Aris. She's a person. Your methods are getting people killed. Their fight was interrupted by the cold, calm voice of Admiral Rostova over the intercom. Thorn, both of you, my ready room. Now. Standing before her, the brothers were like two opposing poles of the same magnet. Your bickering is a luxury we can no longer afford, Rostova said, her cybernetic eye glowing in the dim light. The entity is adapting faster than we anticipated. Those dead zones will multiply. It will attempt to isolate and neutralize every mind on this ship, one by one. It will pick us apart from the inside. She looked at Eris. Doctor, your theories are validated, but your methods are reckless. From now on, every test requires my direct authorization. Then she turned to Elias. Commander, your compassion is a commendable human trait, but it is also a liability. You are a soldier in a war unlike any other. You must be willing to use the ammunition you have. Her gaze drifted to the viewport, toward the hulking, silent form of the Kirun flagship. We cannot win a war of attrition. We cannot fight it in our hallways and our minds. We need to strike a decisive blow. We need to amplify our weapon. A cold dread settled in Elias's stomach. He knew what she was going to say before she said it. The Kirun flagship, Rostova continued, her voice as hard as diamond. Its resonance chamber is a psychic amplifier on a scale we could never construct. We are going to turn that entire ship into a bomb. A dissonance bomb. Eris's eyes widened, this time not with academic glee, but with a flicker of genuine fear. Admiral, the feedback from an amplification of that magnitude, it's theoretical. It could create a psychic shockwave that unravels the minds of everyone in this fleet. It could, Rostova conceded. Or it could be the scream that deafens the silence for good. We have one shot to turn their tomb into our cannon. She fixed her gaze on Elias, her human eye and her cybernetic eye equally piercing. Your team has provided the charge. Now I need someone to rig the detonator. I need a mind strong enough, chaotic enough, to act as the focusing lens for the broadcast. A mind that can hold the combined pain of your entire squad and aim it at the heart of the enemy without shattering. She didn't have to say his name. He was the most resilient, the most fractured, the most poisoned soul they had. He was the perfect trigger. You will lead the team to the flagship. Elias, Rostova commanded. You will interface with the resonance chamber, and you will teach the great silence the meaning of human grief. The return to the Kirun flagship was a funeral procession. The shuttle ride was silent. Each member of Elias's team lost in the grim reality of their mission. They were carrying the ghosts of their past, not as burdens, but as warheads. The ship itself seemed to sense their purpose. The silence was heavier, more oppressive, tinged with a palpable animosity. The dead zones, which had been small, localized pockets on the Valiants, were now vast, roving patches of nothingness that drifted through the corridors like sentient oil slicks. They had to navigate by instinct, by the prickling on their skin that signaled a nearby void. Kalen nearly walked into one, his hand disappearing to the wrist in a patch of shadow that swallowed the beam of his tack light. Elias yanked him back just as the cold, mind-numbing emptiness began to creep up his arm. Eyes sharp, Elias ordered, his own voice sounding thin and distant. "It's not just waiting anymore. It's hunting." They reached the bridge and proceeded to the resonance chamber, their mag boots clanking on the crystalline deck with a sound that felt like sacrilege. Aris and his team, escorted by another Marine squad, followed with the equipment, a portable neural interface cradle, and a focusing array designed to link Elias's mind to the ship's psychic architecture, while Aris's team worked, frantically setting up the apparatus. Elias stood before the spherical chamber, his hand resting on the cool, faintly vibrating surface. This was it, the Nexus, the place where an entire species had screamed its last, silent scream. He was about to add humanity's voice to that choir. "We're ready, Elias," Aris said, his voice softer than usual, his academic arrogance stripped away by the sheer gravity of the moment. "The cradle is synchronized with the resonance chamber. Once you're in, we'll begin uploading the lamentations directly into your neural stream. You will become a conduit. Your consciousness will be the lens that focuses the broadcast." "Just tell me what I need to do," Elias said, his gaze fixed on the shimmering chamber. "You need to hold on," Aris replied, his voice barely a whisper. "You will be channeling the raw, unfiltered trauma of your entire team. It will feel like it's your own. You will drown in it, but you cannot let it consume you. You must find the core of the hush, the source of the silence, and project that pain at it. You're not just screaming into the void, Elias. You have to make the void scream back." Elias nodded, took a deep breath that did nothing to calm the storm in his chest, and lay down in the cradle. The lid hissed shut, plunging him into darkness. A moment later, the neural interface came online, and the world dissolved. He was floating again in the static sea, the endless black ocean from his nightmares. But this time, it was different. The silence was not passive. It was a presence, vast and ancient, a consciousness defined by its own perfect, cold emptiness. He felt its attention turned to him, a slow, indifferent drift, like a galaxy turning on its axis. It recognized the noise of his mind, the chaotic static of his humanity. Then, the first lamentation hit him. It was Kalen's. Suddenly, Elias was no longer Elias. He was a young soldier on Tinus X-1 watching the sky burn as orbital bombardment turned his home to glass. He felt the heat on his face, the agony of loss of physical weight in his chest. He saw the faces of the dead, friends and family, their eyes accusing. The grief was absolute, a tidal wave that threatened to pull him under, to silence him with its sheer, soul-crushing weight. The hush pressed in, sensing the coherence in his sorrow, the order in his pain. It began to seep into the memory, to smooth out the jagged edges, to offer the sweet, cold peace of forgetting. Quiet, it whispered in his mind, "Be still." But then, another voice cut through the silence, his own. "No." He fought back, not with logic or strength, but with pure, stubborn defiance. He clung to the pain, to the rage, to the injustice of it all. This was Kalen's grief, Kalen's scar, and he would not let it be erased. He focused the memory, sharpened its edges into a psychic blade, and hurled it into the vast emptiness. The static sea recoiled. For the first time, he felt the hush experience something other than its own placid existence. It was a flicker of confusion, annoyance, like a still pond disturbed by a stone. Then the other lamentations came, one after another, a relentless, brutal assault. He was Yorick, suffocating in the dark, listening to the final, ragged breaths of his crew. He was Mox, the demolitions expert, haunted by the ghost of a child he couldn't save from a collapsing building. He was every member of his team, living their worst moments, feeling their deepest wounds as his own. Each memory was a new wave of agony, a new attempt by the hush to soothe, to erase, to quiet the noise. And each time, Elias fought back, using the raw, chaotic emotion as a weapon. He was no longer just a man. He was a symphony of suffering, a chorus of human defiance. He was the lighthouse Aris had spoken of, and his light was made of pure, unadulterated pain. Back on the bridge of the Valiants, they watched the impossible happen. The Kirin flagship began to glow, a soft, ethereal light pulsing from within. Subspace sensors went haywire as a wave of pure, unstructured psychic energy began to emanate from the vessel. "He's doing it," Aris breathed, his face bathed in the light of the holoscreen, which displayed Elias's brain activity as a raging, incandescent storm. He's stabilized the feedback loop. He's weaponized it. On the flagship's bridge, the dead zones began to writhe and shrink, pulling back from the overwhelming psychic noise. The very fabric of the ship was screaming. But in the cradle, Elias was losing himself. The lines between his own memories and the lamentations were blurring. He was a broken soldier, a grieving husband, a failed protector. The weight of it all was crushing him. He was drowning. The hush sensed his weakening resolve. It surged forward, its cold presence enveloping him, promising him an end to the pain. Empty. It whispered. The word, a siren's call. Let go. He was so tired. The silence was so peaceful. It would be so easy to just stop. But then, a new memory surfaced. It wasn't a lamentation. It was his own. He was a boy, standing by his father's sickbed. His father, a hard man, a soldier from a forgotten war, was withered and weak, a ghost in his own skin. He had gripped Elias's hand, his voice a dry rasp. "Don't you ever let them silence you, boy," he'd whispered. "Your anger, your fight, that's your soul. Don't you ever let it go quiet." The memory was a spark in the overwhelming darkness. His anger, his fight, his own personal chaos. It was the one thing that was truly his. He grabbed hold of it, fanning the spark into a raging inferno. He stopped channeling the lamentations of his men and unleashed his own. He poured 20 years of war, of loss, of bitter, lonely nights into the broadcast. He dredged up every failure, every regret, every moment of weakness and rage, and he screamed it all into the heart of the static sea. This wasn't a structured lament. This was pure, chaotic, human noise. It was the shriek of a flawed, broken, and utterly defiant soul refusing to be forgotten. The effect was cataclysmic. In the static sea, the vast, placid consciousness of the hush fractured. It was a concept Elias's mind could barely comprehend, like watching a mathematical constant suddenly break. The silence, for the first time in its ageless existence, screamed. On the Valiants, every screen went white. A psychic shockwave, a silent thunderclap, erupted from the Kirin flagship, expanding outward at the speed of thought. Every crew member on every ship in the Last Chance Armada clutched their heads. a phantom echo of Elias's final, defiant roar tearing through their minds. Then, silence. A real silence. The ambient dread was gone. The cold spots in the ship had vanished. The low, psychic hum that had been their constant companion for weeks had simply stopped. Elias awoke with a gasp, the lid of the cradle hissing open. Eris was leaning over him, his face etched with a mixture of awe and terror. Elias sat up, his body trembling, his mind feeling raw, scoured clean. He looked at the resonance chamber. The light within it had faded. The hum was gone. He looked at his brother. Is it over? Eris shook his head slowly, his eyes wide. I don't know, he said, his voice trembling. You didn't just hurt it, Elias. You changed it. You didn't just scream at the silence. You taught it your name. 6 months passed in the shadow of the scream. They called it the Long Quiet. Aboard the ships of the newly christened Sentinel fleet, the oppressive psychic dread had been replaced by an unnerving calm, a stillness that felt less like peace and more like the deep breath a predator takes before it strikes again. The fleet held its station, a lonely picket line of aging warships patrolling the edge of the Veil of Whispers. They were wardens of an empty prison, watching a ghost they had already exorcised. Elias Thorne lived in the heart of that quiet. The raw, screaming agony that had been his weapon was now a muted echo, the psychic equivalent of a phantom limb. He no longer felt the constant, encroaching pressure of the hush, but he was profoundly aware of its absence. He was the scar, and the silence now flowed around him, a river diverted by a great, unmovable stone. His relationship with his team had transformed. The easy barracks camaraderie was gone, replaced by a shared, unspoken reverence. They were the acolytes of a dark miracle, and he was its unwilling saint. They looked at him and saw the man who had walked into the heart of oblivion and made it flinch. He looked at them and saw the faces of the men whose souls he had worn like a borrowed coat. His conversations with Eris were different, too. The academic arrogance was gone, replaced by a cautious, almost fearful curiosity. His brother no longer saw him as a data point of battlefield trauma, but as an anomaly that had broken the known laws of cognitive science. It's the stability that's so remarkable, Eris said one cycle, standing beside Elias on the observation deck. They were watching the swirling, placid nebula that marked the Veil's border. The entity remains fractured. Our deep-range psychic sensors show thousands of disparate, low-energy fragments drifting aimlessly. They're like psychic icebergs, calving off the main body you shattered. They pose no threat. They're just there, echoes in an empty room. They're not trying to merge to reform, Elias asked, his voice low. The question had haunted him for months. On the contrary, Aris mused, tapping at a data slate. They seem to be repelling each other, as if your broadcast didn't just introduce a foreign element, but a fundamental law of repulsion. You taught the silence the concept of self and other, and now it can't stand to be near itself. It's poetically ironic. The first sign that the poetry was a lie came from a deep-range probe designated Echo 7. It was one of a dozen automated sentinels they had seated deep within the Veil, designed to monitor the fractured hush. At 0400 ship time, Echo 7 went silent, but it was not the clean, instantaneous cessation of the old days. The probe's final transmission was not an absence of data, but a deluge of it. For 3.7 seconds, it broadcast a stream of pure, chaotic, meaningless information across all spectrums. Sensor logs filled with impossible readings, temperatures that were simultaneously absolute zero and hotter than a star's core, gravitational fields that folded in on themselves, radiation signatures that violated the laws of causality. But the most terrifying part was the psychic telemetry, the probe's simple AI core, designed for navigation and data collection, had sent a final, desperate burst on the psychic band. It wasn't a message. It was a shriek, a high-frequency, nonsensical torrent of corrupted logic, paradoxical equations, and a repeating loop of its own designation, screamed with the psychic equivalent of panicked, inhuman laughter. Then, nothing. Admiral Rostova's face was a mask of cold iron on the main holotable. The chaotic data from Echo 7 swirled before them, a Jackson Pollock painting of cosmic insanity. "This is not the Hush," she stated, her cybernetic eye glowing with analytical intensity. The Hush was clean. It was an absence. This is a presence, a malignant one. "It's a feedback loop," Eris said, his voice tight with a mixture of horror and fascination. When Elias broadcast the lamentations, he injected a high-entropy cognitive signal into a low-entropy psychic field. We thought it simply scarred the entity. We were wrong. In one of those fragments, it didn't just create a scar. The signal found purchase. It began to replicate. Elias felt a cold dread snake its way up his spine. "Replicate how?" "Think of it like a prion," Eris explained, his eyes wide. "A misfolded protein that forces all other proteins it touches to misfold in the same way. Your scream, your chaotic, beautiful human pain, was the prion." One of the fragments of the Hush didn't just recoil from it. It learned from it. It started to imitate it. It's not a conscious entity. Not like the Hush was. It's a psychic cancer, a mindless, replicating storm of pure, chaotic noise. The mission was inevitable. The Valiants, escorted by 2 frigates, broke formation and pushed deep into the Veil of Whispers. Following the fading trail of Echo 7's final transmission, the journey felt like descending into a diseased lung. The quiet calm of the border gave way to a discordant static at the edge of their psychic senses. It was a faint, irritating hum, like a distant chorus of madmen. They found the source in a sector of space that had once been a stellar nursery. Now, it was a graveyard. The gas clouds were gone, and at the sector's heart was a sight that defied physics. It was a storm, a swirling maelstrom of fractured light and distorted space-time, roughly the size of a small moon. It wasn't made of matter or energy, but of pure, weaponized chaos. It was the psychic noise from Echo 7's last broadcast, given physical form. "We're calling it a cacophony," Rostova's voice announced over the shipwide comm. "All hands to battle stations. All non-essential personnel to shielded quarters. Dr. Thorne, Commander Thorne, to the bridge." On the bridge, the view screen showed the swirling vortex of unreality. It pulsed with sickly, shifting colors, and the space around it warped and buckled. "It's growing," Eris said, his instruments struggling to make sense of the readings. "It's converting ambient energy, even stray matter, into more of itself. It's not just a storm, it's a predator, and its hunger is for order. It's the polar opposite of the Hush." Elias felt a strange, sickening connection to the thing. It was an echo of what he had unleashed in the resonance chamber, a distorted, monstrous reflection of his own pain. This was his ghost, his sin, given form and let loose upon the universe. It was his child, and it was an abomination. Rostova ordered a drone to be sent in. They watched on the view screen as the small, sleek craft approached the edge of the cacophony. For a moment, it held its course. Then, the storm seemed to reach out. Tendrils of distorted light lashed out and enveloped the drone. The craft didn't explode. It unraveled. It's clean. Metallic lines warped and twisted. Its internal systems fired randomly. Its simple AI, for a brief, horrifying second, broadcast a single, panicked query across the comm. Why am I? Then it was gone, absorbed into the swirling, mindless chaos. It doesn't destroy, Elias said, his voice hollow. It corrupts. It makes things as insane as it is. He could feel it now, a psychic pull from the storm's heart. It recognized him. It recognized the source of the original signal, the prime chaotic thought from which it was born. It wasn't a call. It was a resonance, the hum of a tuning fork matching its twin. And in that resonance, he understood the true horror. The hush offered the peace of oblivion, the mercy of being forgotten. The cacophony offered an eternity of screaming madness, the agony of being remade into a broken, meaningless thing. Just as this realization dawned, a priority alert flashed on Rostova's console. A tight beam transmission from Fleet Command, light years away. She read the message, and for the first time since Elias had known her, the iron mask of her composure cracked. A flicker of cold fury flashed in her human eye. "We have new orders," she announced, her voice dangerously low. She forwarded the message to the main holotable. It was from Fleet Admiral Valerius, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, a man known for his brutal pragmatism and his belief that any force in the universe could, and should, be turned into a weapon. The orders were clear. The Sentinel fleet was to contain the cacophony, but make no attempt to destroy it. A fleet of science vessels and a black site operations team were being dispatched. Their objective to study the cacophony, to understand how the chaotic signal replicated, and to learn how to create and direct it. High Command didn't see a monster. They saw an infinitely replicable, non-kinetic weapon of unimaginable power. They saw Project Dissonance made manifest, a force that didn't just kill, but drove entire systems insane. The final directive was the most chilling. Commander Elias Thorne was to be placed under the direct authority of the incoming science team. They wanted to study him, to map his unique neural architecture, to find a way to duplicate the Thorne effect. They wanted to create more triggers. They wanted to build an army of men just like him, an arsenal of broken souls to aim at their enemies. Eris looked from the orders to his brother, his face pale with horror. "They're going to do it," he whispered. "They're going to turn your soul into a production line." Elias looked at the swirling, monstrous storm on the view screen, a cancer born from his own suffering. Then he looked at the orders from a command that saw that suffering as a resource to be exploited. He saw two faces of the same monster, one a mindless and cosmic horror, the other a cold, calculating, and utterly human one. The war against the silence was over. A new war, a war for the soul of humanity itself, was about to begin. He turned to Rostova, his eyes burning with a cold, quiet fire she had never seen before, not even in the depths of his battle rage. "Admiral," he said, his voice calm and steady, filled with the absolute certainty of a man who had stared into two kinds of oblivion and had chosen a third path. Those are not our orders. Rostova watched him for a long, silent moment, her cybernetic eye whirred, calculating odds, weighing consequences, assessing the soul of the man before her. Then, a slow, grim smile touched her lips. "No, Commander," she replied, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper as she severed the link to Fleet Command. "They are not." The Sentinel fleet was no longer just a wall against the dark. It had just become a rebellion,